Hello, my favorite people. How is everybody? I just wanted to do a live today. I promised you the interview with the Ukrainian gentleman. His name is Alexander Skubchenko. And this morning we were going to have live, and then we figured out that from his location, the only way we could connect was via Skype. So we had to reconfigure everything that we are doing. And I have the interview for you. So I will be translating it as we are watching this together. So how is everybody? Type what countries you're watching from before we get started. Let me see. We have Emil Ivanov watching. Frederick is from Manhattan, New York City. Welcome, Frederick. Everybody who's watching on YouTube or Facebook, type some comments where you guys are watching from. And what time is it over there? How is everybody? Make sure that you type some comments so I know where we all are watching from. We have Toronto, Canada, Ontario, wonderful. Molly, welcome. We have Ireland in the house. Augustine, welcome. We have, who do we have? We have your humble poet, respects you and supports you for Congress. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Hello, Elena, good afternoon, says Latina. I love it. I know Latina is our great participant in many lives. We have Klaus from Denmark, welcome. We have Jack from Phoenix, Arizona, love it. We have France in the house, that's Latina. And we have Maria Dismarias in Quebec. We have Dino from Stratford, Ontario, perfect. We have Bill from Rocky Mountains, Canada, I love it, excellent. We have Prague, Czech Republic. Excellent. Everybody type where you're watching from, and then I will play the comments as we go along. I have this great interview, guys, that I was able to get for you today. The man you're going to see in this interview, he grew up in Ukraine, and a lot of you know that I also grew up in the Soviet Union at the time. And then now that territory is Ukraine, and it became Ukraine in the 90s when I just graduated university, I believe 92, around that same time in Ukraine. So he does not speak English, so I will be translating you this interview. But I was particularly interested to get his perspective and bring it to you guys, because he is actually living in Ukraine. Now he moved, to my understanding, is outside Ukraine because after the military operation by Russia was started in 2022, he actually was under repressions by Zelensky regime. You know, Zelensky is fighting all the people who he considers pro-Russian or people who have anything to do with criticizing Zelensky's regime. So my understanding that Alexander Skubchenko, the gentleman you see on your screen, he was the outspoken person, and obviously Zelensky regime didn't like it. But Alexander lived through entire years of Ukraine's independence, and here's what he had to say about what is happening in Ukraine. Hi, Barry from Sicily, welcome. And you guys are going to have this exclusive interview played right before your eyes right now. So let's all tune in and listen to my interview with Alexander. We speak Russian. That's the language that we were able to converse on this interview, but I will be translating to you what we are saying and how he talks about Zelensky, Ukraine. Is Ukraine a democracy? What's happening in Ukraine? Obviously, he lived in Ukraine for the last 30 years of Ukraine's independence. So he knows a lot about what's happening in Ukraine. So let's listen in. I'm going to play this interview and translate to you as we go. Сегодня.
Родился я на Украине.
I am asking Alexander about Ukraine and what Ukraine looks like these days, what is happening in Ukraine, and I asked him to introduce himself and where he was born and where he is from.
Еще во времена Советского Союза, в конце.
He says, I was born in Ukraine during the Soviet time yet, at the time it was Soviet Union.
70-х годов прошлого века.
In the 70s of the last century, he was born in 1978.
Жил все это время на Украине в 91
I lived all this time in Ukraine.
году, то есть я старше Украины, получается, когда создали
I am older than Ukraine because
Украину после развала Советского Союза в 91 году, то есть я
when Ukraine was created and became independent per se as a state in 1991,
был в Украине. Последнее
I lived and I was in Ukraine all this time since I was born in 1978.
20 лет до лета, до июня прошлого года я жил в Киеве. Вот.
And the last 20 years of his current life, he spent living in the capital of Ukraine, city of Kiev.
Когда Россия начала военную операцию, я был в Киеве, потом
When Russia started its military operation, I was in Kiev, capital of Ukraine, he says.
преследование безопасности Украины.
And I immediately became harassed by the special services of Ukraine when Russian military operation started in 2022, he says.
Обыск, избиение, уголовное.
I got my house searched, they beat me up, and they started to provoke different criminal charges against me for no reason.
Дело как врага государства, но мне удалось сбежать, и вот
But I was lucky and I was able to escape, he says.
сейчас, да, я здесь, в России. Поэтому
Now I'm here in Russia, he says.
все, что происходило на Украине, особенно после 2014 года, я это знаю не из новостей, я это прожил там.
That's why everything that was happening in Ukraine, I don't know that from the news channels. I was actually living all of it and all the events, especially after 2014 in Ukraine. If you guys remember, there was this big coup that took down a legally elected president of Ukraine, that Obama administration, Biden were involved. Victoria Nuland was there. Of course, the EU was participating. So he's saying that all the events in Ukraine, he didn't just learn about them on the news. He actually lived it in Ukraine.
Я знаю, что там было не из телевизора, а как это было на самом деле. Потому что вот многие говорят, что война началась вот только 24 февраля прошлого года, но это ложь.
He says many people say that the war in Ukraine only started in 2022. From the February of last year, but it's a lie, he says.
На Украине даже до Зеленского был Порошенко, он всегда вот постоянно говорил, да, это же данные ООН, мониторинговой миссии ООН, которая говорила, что с 2014 года на Украине уже было погибших 15 тысяч человек.
He says that even from previous president before Zelensky, whose name was President Poroshenko, even UN documented that there was about 15,000 people that died in the war in Ukraine since 2014. And I made it from myself. As you know, guys, the Ukraine has been bombing eastern Ukraine and Donbass region since 2014. He's just basically reiterating that the war started not in 2022, but the war in Ukraine was going on since 2014. And even UN mission in Ukraine documented 15,000 people dead before Russia was ever even involved in this in 2022.
В Донецкой и Луганской области они были разрушены практически, многие, да, там разрушения.
He says Donetsk and Lugansk regions were totally destroyed already before this time, before 2022.
Жилых домов шли на десятки тысяч. А что это тогда, если война началась только в прошлом году? А то, что было тогда?
He says that if all these buildings were already ruined and civilians were already dead in Ukraine before 2022, what was it then if it's not a war? It was definitely a war that was going on before Russia came in 2022.
Война была в Донецке, аллея ангелов, это аллея убитых детей. Там...
In Donetsk, there is an alley of angels. What is it? It's an alley of killed children, the children that were killed by Ukrainian shelling of eastern Ukraine. That was Donetsk city.
Несколько сот убитых детей, которые были убиты войной после 2014 года. Их же убила Украина.
Those children who were killed by the war that started after 2014 and goes to this day, hundreds of children dead. Those children were killed by Ukraine, he is saying.
То есть по Конституции Украины применять вооруженные силы Украины против граждан Украины запрещено.
According to Constitution of Ukraine, he says, it's illegal to use weapons against your own citizens on your own territory. And Ukraine was still doing it.
В 2014 году, после государственного переворота, когда незаконно к власти пришел Турчинов, он объявил антитеррористическую операцию.
After 2014 coup, when illegally the coup government came to power, there was somebody by the name Turchinov who announced what they called in Ukraine anti-terror operation. В
апреле 2014 года направил вооруженные силы Украины в Донбасс.
And he then sent, in April of 2014, military armed forces into eastern Ukraine, Donbass region.
По Конституции этого делать нельзя.
Under Ukraine's constitution, you cannot do that. It's unconstitutional, he says.
В террористической операции могут принимать участие только правоохранительные органы, то есть службы.
He says even if they wanted to conduct some type of a limited anti-terror operation, whatever they called it, you cannot send army to do it. He said you can only send, let's say, police force or public safety force.
Безопасности и МВД, но он направил вооруженные силы Украины.
But he sent armed forces of Ukraine, that Mr. Turchinov sent armed forces of Ukraine to basically fight their own citizens in eastern Ukraine, Donbass region.
Люди, это много видео этих есть, они же в открытом доступе, когда люди эти танки пытались просто с собой остановить.
He says you can see a lot of videos of that period of 2014 when Ukraine sent armed forces, military, basically to kill and submit their own citizens in eastern Ukraine who did not agree to the Western-backed coup in Ukraine. He says you can see those videos all over the internet when tanks are rolling into the city and people are trying to protest the tanks and trying to push them and touch them with their hands and throw their bodies in front of the tanks. But the tanks were rolling in, and that was sent by Ukrainian government against their own people of eastern Ukraine, Donbass region, he says.
Но танками людей давили, то есть говорят, что Россия, ну как Россия начала?
They were running over people with the tanks. He says they say it's Russia's fault, as Russia was doing it. He's no.
Если танки поехали с Киева.
The tanks were coming from Kiev, capital of Ukraine. They were not Russian tanks. They were Ukrainian tanks sent from the capital, Kiev.
Поэтому война длится очень долго. Для меня война идет с 2014 года.
For me, he says, the war is already lasting a long time. It's already lasting since 2014 in Ukraine.
Ну, вот то, что было в феврале, это было просто уже вот как закономерное продолжение.
And what happened in February when Russia came in, it was just the inevitable continuation of what was going on already in Ukraine since 2014, he says. Вы бы хотели сказать американскому народу, что бы вы хотели сказать американскому народу вот о ситуации в Украине? Знаем ли мы правду? Here I am asking him, what would you like to say to American people? Do we know the truth? I am asking him. Или как вы считаете, мы не знаем правду о ситуации на Украине? Вы сейчас осветили 2014 год и то, как Украина уже с 2014 года бомбит своих собственных граждан против всех международных конвенций. And I'm saying that you just now, to Alexander, I'm saying, mentioned that how Ukraine is bombing its own citizens in eastern part of Ukraine against all the international conventions. I'm asking him, does he think that we American people know the truth? And I obviously know that we don't. At large, American people are in the dark. Которые существуют, граждан, женщин, детей, стариков. И у нас в американской прессе это не освещается. I'm saying to him that Ukraine has been and is killing its own citizens since 2014, but our American media does not show it. It doesn't tell us about it in America, I'm telling him. Абсолютно, и не освещалось за все эти годы. До сих пор наш господин Байден, наш президент, выходит на трибуны и говорит о том, что Россия начала войну в... I'm telling him that until this day, Biden comes out on the pulpit and tells us all in America here that it's Russia who is the aggressor. Russia is the one who started this war. В 2022 году. And it's only started in 2022. И все 9 лет почти уже теперь украинской агрессии против своих собственных людей не существует. And all the 9 years, I'm saying, of Ukrainian aggression against its own people of Eastern Ukraine does not exist. And those people were children, women, elderly, men. Those people were dying. But in Biden narrative, these 9 years are missing from his narrative. And in his speeches, the war only started in 2022. Well, obviously, we know that Ukraine's been bombing its own citizens since 2014, which Alexander Skubchenko, the gentleman I'm interviewing, just said he is from Ukraine and he lived through all these years there. В их нарративах, ни в прессе, ни на телевидении, ни в словах президента, ни в словах конгрессменов. I'm saying to him that those 9 years of Ukraine bombing its own people to this day do not exist in president's narrative, Congress people's narratives, our media doesn't say it, like as if it doesn't exist and never happened. Как будто этих лет, когда Украина убивает своих собственных людей, вообще не было и нет и не существует. И как будто, как вы правильно сказали, война только началась в 2022 году. As if the war only started in 2022. Что бы вы хотели донести до американских людей, которые живут вот в этом информационном голоде правды практически нет? I'm asking him, what would he like to say to American people who are living in this hunger for truth, in this void where we're not told the truth? What would he like to say to American people, being from Ukraine that he lived up till a few months back, I believe, and he lives through this entire situation of Ukraine and start of Russia's special military operation. Что бы вы хотели сказать?
Я хочу сказать одно. Украина это
I want to tell American people only one thing.
не демократическое государство.
Ukraine is not a democratic state, he says.
Никаких проявлений демократии после 2014 года на Украине.
There are no democratic tendencies even in Ukraine after 2014 at all. They're all missing. There is no democracy in Ukraine.
Нет. Режим Зеленского – это тоталитарный, преступный режим, причем нацистский режим.
The regime of Zelensky is a totalitarian, criminal regime, he says. And that regime is also Nazi regime, nationalistic Nazi regime, he says.
Говорят, что Зеленский, Байден любит говорить, что Зеленский еврей, значит, он не может быть нацистом.
He says, Biden always says on TV that Zelensky, being a Jew, cannot be a Nazi.
Но это ложь.
This is a lie, he says.
То, что национальность Зеленского ни о чем не говорит.
Zelensky's national ethnic group of being a Jew does not mean anything in this context, he says.
Это нацистское государство. Нацисты уничтожают православие.
Because this is now a Nazi state, Ukraine. And just because Zelensky is a Jew, that doesn't mean that Ukraine somehow is not a Nazi regime. It is a Nazi regime that kills its own people, that is now waging war on Russian Orthodox Church.
Украинскую православную церковь, убивают священников.
They're killing priests in
Идут
Ukraine.
репрессии. Я
There are repressions in Ukraine against anybody who speaks out.
один из политически репрессированных людей.
I am one of the politically repressed people oppressed by Zelensky regime, he says.
Тысячи людей находятся в тюрьмах
Thousands of people are in Ukrainian prisons, he says.
Украины. Многих просто убили.
Many are simply just killed.
Война идет с 2014 года.
The war started and it's ongoing since 2014 in Ukraine, he says.
Байден, это, вот для меня, как гражданина Украины,
And Biden, for me, as a citizen of Ukraine, he says,
это преступник, да.
he is a criminal.
То есть единственное затишье на Украине были исключительно во времена Трампа.
The only period of breather, the only breather period that Ukraine had in this ongoing war since 2014 was during President Trump. It was a little bit of a slowdown. It was a little bit easier as far as the war that was going in Ukraine. During Trump, he says, it was eased up a little bit.
Да, он не смог принести Украине мир.
Yes, Trump could not bring peace to Ukraine.
Но при нем, по крайней мере, были вот эти 4 года передышки.
But at least we had 4 years of break. It was 4 years of a little bit easier to breathe as far as the war which was going on. It was just a bit of ease that happened during those 4 Trump years.
По крайней мере, не было эскалации.
There was no escalation during Trump administration, he says.
Вот государственный переворот совершили. Это не пришли там как-то законы к власти Порошенко, там Турчинов. Нет, это был государственный переворот.
Those people who conducted the coup in 2014, they didn't come to power legally.
Прямой поддержки Соединенных Штатов.
It was done with the direct support from United States, the coup in Ukraine of 2014.
Виктория Нуланд, она не вылазила с Майдана.
Victoria Nuland, she was constantly at the Parliament Square engaging with protesters and fueling the protests against, at that time, legally elected President Yanukovych in Ukraine.
Она это все курировала тогда.
She was curating all of that the coup situation in Ukraine in 2014, he says.
После этого началась война.
After that, the war started in Ukraine in 2014.
Эту войну не Россия.
This war was not started by Russia.
На Майдане уже тогда был правый сектор, это были нацисты.
At that time, on 2014, there were already Nazi elements in the square before the parliament called Right Sector Battalion. And they were real Nazis, he says.
Они уже убивали людей. Это было вот...
They already killed people in Ukraine.
Вооруженные, да, то есть...
They were already armed.
Юрий Луценко, который потом стал генеральным прокурором Украины, он тогда с Майдана говорил, что потерпите немного, к своим обращался с сцены Майдана, потерпите, оружие уже едет. То есть вот...
There was a gentleman who was at that time basically a DA in Ukraine, and he was talking to protesters and was telling to these nationalist protesters, saying, wait a little bit longer, the weapons are coming your way. So they were basically arming those Nazi elements in Ukraine already during 2014 Maidan protests that, of course, we know ended up in a Western-backed coup that removed legally elected president of Ukraine back then.
Этот правый сектор, он еще до того, как был совершен переворот, они же захватывали вооруженные части, да? Они захватывали здание МВД, здание службы безопасности, а там оружейные комнаты. Более 10 тысяч стволов оружия было у них на руках. Это было...
He's saying that nationalistic element, those Ukrainian neo-Nazi ideology type battalions, they were already capturing the weapons warehouses, and they already had 10,000 weapons in their hands back then in 2014.
Тоже, по сути, вооруженная банда, когда они...
Basically armed bandits they became.
Под гарантией Янукович согласился, это же были гаранты, это были европейские послы, которые ему гарантировали, что ты отводишь, да, правоохранителей, а оппозиция соглашается на досрочные выборы.
So what was happening, he says, in 2014, that legally elected President Yanukovych was negotiating with ambassadors from the European countries who promised him if he peacefully calls back the public safety police and from the protesters, then, and he agrees to the early re-election or early elections in Ukraine, that he will be guaranteed peaceful outcome of these protests. But that never happened. As soon as he called off the public safety police, then the armed Nazi militants stormed the parliament and seized the power. So European countries who were trying to say that they're negotiating this, they basically all lied. And as soon as the president removed the police forces, then the armed militants and neo-Nazi elements stormed the Ukrainian parliament and seized the power in Ukraine.
Только Янукович поверил европейским послам, которые его обманули, отвел правоохранителей, сразу же они пошли и захватили власть, незаконно захватили.
They took that power illegally by force with weapons and basically ousted President Yanukovych back then in 2014 in Western-backed coup. And he's saying that European ambassadors lied to Yanukovych, that it will be next elections or some type of agreement with opposition. Nothing like that happened. He called back the police forces from the protesters, but the neo-Nazis and militants basically went to parliament and seized power immediately. So there was no elections. European ambassadors lied, he says.
И сразу же они отправили, так называемые, они это назвали, поезда дружбы в Крым и на Донбасс. Они вооруженные поехали, правый сектор, боевики. У них был лозунг, да, что мы сейчас научим этих русских, ну а Юго-Восток, Донбасс, Крым, там живут русские люди, русские.
And he says immediately the right sector, those militants, was sent on what they call the trains of friendship, which is a sarcastic term. So they were immediately sent to Crimea, an eastern area of Ukraine, Donbass region, where the Russian speakers live. And their slogan of right sector, this militant Nazi formation of Ukraine, was, we're going to go teach those Russians now. We're going to teach them a lesson.
И они поехали под лозунгом, мы сейчас научим русских любить Бандеру.
And their slogan was, we're going to go teach Russians to love Bandera. You know who Stepan Bandera is, right? Ukrainian nationalist who collaborated with Hitler during World War II. Who formed the volunteer Ukraine SS battalion, division rather, that slaughtered hundreds of thousands of Jews, Russians at the time, Gypsy people, Romani people, people of all in ethnic group cleansings. They've killed anybody who didn't subscribe to their neo-Nazi, at the time, Nazi Hitler ideology. So this Ukrainian man you see on your camera is saying that this right sector, after they seized power of Ukraine, their slogan was, we're going to travel to Crimea and Eastern Ukraine and teach those Russian ethnic speakers there how to love Bandera, basically how to love Nazi collaborator. By the way, Stepan Bandera now in Ukraine is hailed as a national hero. They have monuments to him. They name streets after him, and they sing praise to him. And his slogan, glory to Ukraine, hail heroes, hail Ukraine, is Stepan Bandera's slogan. So Alexander Skubchenko, who you see on your screen right now, is telling us the story of what is happening in what was happening in Ukraine back then and what led to this war and how this war really started in Ukraine.
Да, что Крым будет или бандеровским, или безлюдным. Это они.
He said that right sector Nazi militants declared that Crimea will be either loving Bandera or it will be depopulated. There either not going to be any people there or they all will be forced to love Bandera. Stepan Bandera, Nazi Ukrainian nationalist, collaborated during Hitler's time.
Говорили. И вот с этого все началось.
And this is where it all began, he says.
И Байден, он поддерживал же Порошенко, да, то есть.
And Biden supported the President Poroshenko, who came to be president after the coup took place in Ukraine, Western-backed coup in 2014.
С 2014 года украинцам поддержки не было никакой.
So Ukrainian people themselves had no support at all. The people.
Пенсии рухнули,
The pensions were not paid.
социальная поддержка рухнула, но зато все
Social packages were non-existent. Social support, the programs for seniors, they were non-existent.
стоимость жилищных услуг возросла, стоимость газа
The gas prices rose, the utilities prices rose. So people of Ukraine had no support since starting that time, completely left to fend for themselves.
выросла в разы. И, безусловно, а кто? Нафтогаз Украины, который это все продавал, он контролировался людьми Байдена.
And of course, the oil gas company that was selling Ukrainian people all these utility services and energy services, they were controlled by Biden and his crew, basically, and people of Biden.
Сыном Байдена был коррупционный
And the son of Biden.
скандал, вот тот, который Байден потом замял.
There was a big corruption scandal in Ukraine, the scandal that Biden actually tried to suppress and squashed eventually.
Это же все было сын Байдена, он грабил Украину.
The son of Biden was robbing Ukraine. That's why the scandal in Ukraine happened, because it was found out that all these rising prices and high tariffs on energy bills and everything else were instituted by Ukrainian company called Naftogaz, oil gas, and that company was controlled by Biden and his son, he's saying.
И вот потом, когда Зеленский пришел к власти, он пришел, он обещал мир любой ценой.
And when Zelensky came to power, Zelensky promised peace at all costs to people.
Он обещал снизить тарифы, он обещал,
He promised to bring the prices down. He promised to bring the tariffs on energy down for people, for regular Ukrainian citizens.
что при нем не будут запрещать русский язык. И
He promised, Zelensky promised, that they will not ban Russian language when he is the president. Zelensky promised that to Ukrainian people.
что после этого стало? Тарифы при нем выросли.
And he says, and what happened after that, after all those promises Zelensky made?
Он обещал мир, но он привел
The prices rose up. He promised us the peace,
страну к войне. То есть
but he brought country to the war.
это же Зеленский сказал, Россия просила исполнить Минские соглашения.
It's Zelensky who said that Russia was asking nothing much but fulfill Minsk agreements.
Если бы Зеленский год назад исполнил Минские соглашения, то ДНР и ЛНР сегодня были бы в составе Украины.
If Zelensky would fulfill and followed and implement in Minsk agreements, Minsk peace accords, ceasefire accords that were signed between 2014-2015, and Zelensky came to power in 2019. So Alexander, the gentleman from Ukraine who you see on your screen, says if Zelensky implemented those Minsk agreements when Zelensky became a president in 2019, then the regions of eastern Ukraine, Donetsk and Lugansk, would still be a part of Ukraine. But now, since Russian military operations started, and those regions now voted via referenda to join Russia. But he's saying if Zelensky followed Minsk peace accords, peace agreements, those regions would still be a part of Ukraine. Ukraine.
Совершенно верно. Без единого выстрела.
And would not be any shots fired, he says.
Зеленский сказал, что это поражение. Ему нужна победа.
But Zelensky turned around and then said, oh, if we do that, then it will be a defeat. And I want victory. Zelensky wants victory.
Надо покарать людей, которые были на Донбассе.
Alexander says Zelensky wants to punish people of Donbass.
Надо там, то есть победа нужна. То есть он отверг Минские соглашения.
Zelensky wants victory, meaning he basically rejected Minsk agreements, Minsk peace agreements.
США и Европа его вооружали. Он уже
United States and Europe are arming Zelensky.
готовился к войне.
And they were arming him already once he became a president, and he was preparing for war, Zelensky was.
И, безусловно, эта война бы была.
And of course, this war would have happened, Alexander says.
Сейчас, вот я хочу просто, чтобы американцы это поняли.
I want to just to relay it to American people for them to understand this, says Alexander, who is from Ukraine.
Вот сейчас в информационном пространстве на Западе это звучит так, будто бы Россия напала на Украину.
Right now, in the Western media, it sounds as if Russia is aggressor and Russia attacked Ukraine.
Украина воюет, а Запад Украине помогает.
And as if West is just helping Ukraine to fight.
Ну, послушайте, если вот мы посмотрим на эту войну, да, война ведется за деньги США и...
But if we look at this war is being carried out at the United States expense and for the money of United States that the United States is sending.
Европы.
And for the money of Europe that it's sending to Ukraine.
Военная техника стран НАТО, да, США.
And all the weapons and all the technology from the NATO countries.
И НАТО. Разведка стран НАТО.
The reconnaissance is from NATO countries.
То есть вот деньги на войну, все это стран НАТО. То есть от Украины там только территория и граждане Украины.
From Ukraine in this war, there is nothing other than territory of the war and the people who are fighting the war. But all the money, technology, weapons, reconnaissance, all the heavy weaponry, this is also and the money supplied by NATO countries, United States and EU.
Которые просто как пушечное мясо вот тут.
So Ukrainians who only supply to this war the territory and the people are basically being used as a cannon fodder.
Бойню толкают. Так кто воюет?
And they have been pushed into this meat grinder.
России. НАТО воюет с Россией на Украине или Украина воюет? Если завтра просто...
So who is fighting? Is it Ukraine fighting Russia or is it NATO fighting Russia?
Прекратится финансирование, войны не будет, потому что...
If tomorrow the financing of this war and fueling of this conflict via Western finances would stop, this war would end tomorrow.
Что Украине воевать будет нечем.
Because Ukraine will not have anything to fight with.
Воюет Запад. Для Запада...
It's Western countries who are fighting.
Украина это просто поле боя с Россией.
Ukraine is simply a battlefield for the West to fight Russia. Ukraine is basically providing its territory as a battlefield for the West to fight against Russia.
Вот и все. То есть Украине не повезло только в том, что она находится, у нее общая граница с Россией. Если...
The only disadvantage and the bad luck for Ukraine that it shares the border with Russia.
Если бы Украина была где-то в Африке, то никому бы она, ни Соединенным Штатам, ни Британии, ни Европе, то Украина была бы не нужна.
If Ukraine was located someplace in Africa, then neither United States or European countries would be interested in this war. Ukraine is only interesting for the West to fight and fuel this war just because it shares a border with Russia.
Просто американцы должны понимать, что Байден эту войну ведет.
Americans have to understand it's Biden who is fighting this war.
Последние 4 года это было только при Трампе, когда была передышка.
The only time we had a bit of a break and a little bit easier time of this war was not so intense. That was during Trump administration.
Когда, ну, по сути, не было горячей фазы войны.
We did not have this horrible hot phase of the war during Trump years. Александр, то есть вы считаете, что поставки вооружения на Украину не помогают Украине, а они наоборот разжигают эту войну и удлиняют страдания украинцев? And I am asking him that if he thinks that the fueling of the war by Western weapons supplies is only prolonging the suffering of Ukrainian people and not saving Ukrainian people. Народа и увеличивают смерть украинских солдат и украинских. And the weapons and the war and funneling all of this into Ukraine, it increases the deaths of Ukrainian soldiers and Ukrainian people. Я вас правильно поняла?
Безусловно, но вот.
He says yes, of course.
Смотрите, НАТО ведет войну с Россией, да? Вот.
Look, NATO is fighting the war with Russia.
Если бы не было Украины, то странам НАТО нужно было бы мобилизовать своих граждан.
He says, imagine if there was no Ukraine, then the NATO countries would have to mobilize and draft their own citizens to go fight Russia.
Стран Европы, граждан США, да?
They would have to recruit and draft Americans, and they would have to recruit and draft Europeans into this to go fight Russia into this war.
Их вооружать и их бы.
And then they would have to arm their own citizens.
Граждане, граждане США, европейские государства умирали бы в этой войне.
And their own citizens of Europe and their own citizens of United States would have been dying in this war.
Разрушения были бы на территории европейских.
All the destruction of the buildings, property, infrastructure that are caused by this war would be happening on the territory of Europe then, or United States.
А так для НАТО сложилось все очень удачно.
Otherwise, now for NATO, things are looking pretty peachy, that they don't have to do all of that, send their own citizens or fight on their own territory.
Зеленский своим законом запретил выезд из страны всем мужчинам, да, всем лицам мужского пола из Украины.
Zelensky prohibited all males to leave the country of Ukraine, because obviously they will be drafted and they need to be inside Ukraine to be drafted into the fight, the military.
Нельзя выехать. Их все просто военкомы хватают на улицах. Сколько видео там просто всех подряд. Вот на улице люди прячутся от них уже. Хватают и все.
And he says how many videos that we see that military commissariat of Ukraine runs around the streets and basically grabs every male that they can find. And they're hiding and catching these people unawares at the store, on the street, hiding in the cars, ambushing them, basically trying to push them and grab Ukrainian men to go fight.
Для НАТО же это выгодно.
For NATO, it's very beneficial that Ukrainians are being dragged and drafted and not their own citizens.
Они только тратят деньги.
NATO is only spending money.
Разрушение на Украине.
The destruction happens in Ukraine. The citizens of Ukraine are the ones who are dying. For NATO is a very good deal.
Умирают украинцы.
The dying is also done by Ukrainians. The ones who are dying is Ukrainians.
Они же прямо, министр обороны Резник, он прямо говорит, что НАТО очень сильно повезло, что сейчас украинцы умирают за их интересы.
Even Ukrainian Minister of Defense recently came out and said that NATO is very lucky that now Ukrainians are dying for their interests.
Так вы нам хотя бы деньги за это давайте.
And Minister of Ukraine said, Minister of Ukraine said that NATO, you're so lucky that you have Ukrainians dying for your interests, so you better give us money so we continue doing what you want us to do.
Говорит Резников, да, который подчиняется даже не Зеленскому, а Пентагону в США.
And this guy by the name of Reznik, who came out and said that, demanding that United States sends more money because Ukrainians are the ones who are doing all the heavy lifting in this war. Alexander, the guy you see on your screen from Ukraine, he says that guy is in direct communication and under direct orders of Pentagon.
И, безусловно, для США это, конечно же, выгодно.
Of course, for United States, this is a very lucrative war because they don't have to send their citizens to die and their own infrastructure being destroyed. It's all happening in Ukraine by Ukrainians and not on United States or European territory.
Чужими руками на чужой территории, которая им, по сути, не интересна.
So it's very lucrative and beneficial for United States and Europe and NATO to fight the war on somebody else's territory by somebody else's hands, in this case, Ukrainian hands. Спасибо, Александр, за такое прекрасное объяснение, детальное объяснение. Я надеюсь, американские люди нас услышат. Я буду это интервью показывать тем, кто... И во всем мире у меня есть люди на моих страничках из всего мира, поэтому я очень рада, что вы говорите правду. Конечно, я правду знаю, но мне хотелось услышать это от вас, от человека, который через это все прожил. Скажите, почему украинские люди избрали Зеленского, но, как вы думаете, он оправдал их ожидания? Потому что я смотрела дебаты с Порошенко, когда были выборы, и у меня сложилось впечатление, что люди надеялись, когда Зеленский сказал, что я не ваш оппонент, а я ваш приговор. Я прямо даже как-то обрадовалась за то, что наконец-то кто-то закончит войну на Донбассе, которую развязала Украина. А потом, когда я увидела, когда Зеленского была инаугурация, он сказал, что нашим первым делом это будет остановить бомбежку Донбасса. Он сказал в своей инаугурационной речи. И этого не произошло. Как вы считаете, Зеленский обманул украинский народ? Что случилось? Почему была такая риторика? Больше 70% украинцев проголосовали за него, ну, если мы надеемся, что выборы были честные. Here, when I'm telling Alexander that when Zelensky came to power in 2019 in Ukraine, 70% of Ukrainians voted for him, because he basically said in his inauguration that Ukraine will stop shelling Donbass, that he will bring peace. And so I'm asking Alexander, who you see on your screen, Alexander Skubchenko, who is from Ukraine, whether Zelensky basically lied to Ukrainian people, or did he trick Ukrainian people by promising to bring peace, but he just brought more war? And I'm asking Alexander to answer and tell me, what do you think changed? Why did Zelensky promise peace and promised as the first order of business on his inauguration day in 2019 to stop shelling Donbass? But he never stopped shelling Donbass. The shelling of Eastern Ukraine, Donbass region, which now is controlled by Russia and became Russians' part after the 2022 Russia military operation and referendum. Why is it Alexander thinks, did Zelensky change? Why did he change so much? Promised peace and brought more war. Promised to stop shelling Donbass, but never stopped shelling Donbass. What changed from before he was the president, when he was running, and when he was inaugurated? He promised to do that. All of these good things, but then suddenly never did and only brought more war. I'm trying to see what Alexander thinks. Did Zelensky basically lie and did he fail Ukrainian people by not delivering on his promises? И вдруг такой поворот. Ваши мысли, что случилось с Зеленским? И оправдал ожидания? I'm saying, what happened to Zelensky, and did he fail Ukrainian people?
Он не обманул, он предал. Да, действительно, люди устали.
Alexander from Ukraine says, he didn't trick Ukrainian people, he betrayed Ukrainian people.
От войны, вот когда был Порошенко в 2019 году, социология.
People already, by the year 2019, people already were tired of the war that was raging in Ukraine since civil war since 2014. At that time, before Zelensky, the president was Poroshenko. And Alexander says that people were tired of that Poroshenko president, and that they were hoping that Zelensky is going to bring peace. And most people were actually voting not so much for Zelensky, but against Poroshenko, who actually was basically pretty much fine with the war and fine with Ukraine bombing its own people. So Alexander says people were hoping that Zelensky will bring peace, but more so they just didn't want Poroshenko to continue. So
там, когда опрашивали людей, да, то есть они там больше 80% они не поддерживали курс Порошенко.
He says when people were asked in social polls, in election polls, they were saying that around 80% of them were against the current president Poroshenko at the time when Zelensky was running for re-election. And as you remember, Poroshenko and Zelensky both were running for the spot for Ukraine's presidency, and Zelensky won with, I believe, over 70% vote at the time.
Больше 80% людей хотели мира, да. И вот появляется Зеленский, то есть Порошенко, он уже начал запрещать русский язык, он уже...
He says the people at large already didn't want Poroshenko to continue to be elected for the second term, and 80% disapproved of his record, and people wanted peace. But even Poroshenko already started to prohibit Russian language.
Уже начал гонение на православную церковь. Он
And he already started to harass Russian Orthodox Church at the time, Poroshenko, before Zelensky.
уже воспринимался как президент войны, который не
He already, Poroshenko, was viewed as a president of war.
исполнит Минские соглашения.
And they figured that he's not going to follow Minsk agreements.
И вот появляется Зеленский.
So here comes Zelensky.
Он вел свою избирательную кампанию на русском языке, да.
Zelensky carried out his presidential campaign in Ukraine in Russian language.
Давая понять, на Украине победить президент, то есть это такая вот традиция, на Юго-Востоке живет большее число людей, потому что там
In Ukraine, most population lives in the eastern part of Ukraine, not in the western. It's more heavier populated, the eastern part of Ukraine.
городская застройка,
Because there are lots of cities and there's very dense population there in the eastern part of Ukraine.
большие крупные промышленные города, живет больше людей. Эти люди русские.
Those people are living in very industrial type cities, and they're largely Russian, ethnic Russians.
И чтобы победить на выборах, нужно заискивать перед ними, да, то есть вот те вот люди, которые на Западной Украине, которые проевропейские.
In order to win the president's elections in Ukraine, he had to, or one would have to appeal to the residents of Eastern Ukraine because it's more densely populated. There are more people who live in Eastern Ukraine, but they're mostly ethnic Russian and Russian speakers in Eastern Ukraine.
Которые там вот Бандеру любят и всех остальных, их мало. Они могут.
The people who live in Western Ukraine, Alexander says, the ones who actually are the most fond of Stepan Bandera, Nazi collaborator, Ukrainian nationalist in World War II of Ukraine, he says those people who live in Western Ukraine, they could usually not win the election because that area is just not so heavily populated as in Eastern Ukraine. And those people can only come to power via coup, because there's not just enough votes in that area. And people of Eastern Ukraine are a much larger population of Ukraine, and those are mostly Russian ethnic speakers.
Могут прийти к власти исключительно путем государственного переворота, как это было сделано в 2004 году, в 2004 и в 2014. Так вот, Зеленский шел на выборы, и он...
He says that's exactly what was done in 2004 Ukrainian Orange Revolution and 2014. During the coup, Western-backed coup, that they basically, those pro-Bandera, Western-type Ukrainian population that really likes Bandera, Stepan Bandera, because he was from that region. He says that those people basically came to power via Western-backed coup in 2014 because they cannot come to power, according to Alexander, by other means other than grabbing and seizing the power, because the majority of people live in eastern area of Ukraine and they're not fond of Bandera, nationalist Ukrainian who was the Hitler collaborator.
Давал посылы на русском языке, говорил, да, я не буду запрещать русский язык, мир любой ценой.
And Zelensky promised that he will not ban Russian language. He carried out his presidential campaign in Russia, in Russian language. He said that peace at all costs.
Безусловно, люди этого хотели. Он сказал Порошенко, что я не ваш, да, оппонент, а ваш приговор. Люди за него голосовали даже не за него, больше не за Зеленского. Они голосовали это как против Порошенко.
And he said that when Zelensky was debating Poroshenko, when they were both running for the president seat in Ukraine in 2019, Zelensky told Poroshenko that I am not your opponent, I am your sentence. By the way, I watched those debates. He is correct. That's what Zelensky said. So he said the people who are voting, they believed the promises and what Zelensky was saying, that he's not going to ban Russian language, that he wants peace at all costs.
Порошенко, то есть против Порошенко, за него
And so the people who voted for Zelensky, they were pretty much voting against Poroshenko by voting for Zelensky.
Голосовали больше 70% людей.
More than 70% of the people of Ukraine voted for Zelensky in 2019 when he became president.
Вот Донецкая и Луганская области, там, где была война, да, за Зеленского отдали больше 90% голосов. Вдумайтесь просто, как они верили этому человеку. И после этого Зеленский всех...
He said that the people of Eastern Ukraine were actually the largest percentage of those who voted for Zelensky, over 90%. And he said when Zelensky came to power, he betrayed them all.
Предал. Первая его поездка была, это было в Лондон, когда он и глава его офиса Ермак, ну тогда был Андрей Богдан, это был как раз 19-й год перед встречей в Париже нормандского формата с Путиным. И они были где-то там в подвалах Ми-6 британской разведки. Вы можете назвать еще хоть одного президента суверенного государства, который идет на прием к главе чужой иностранной разведки?
And he says Zelensky, just after he became president, his first visit was to London, to MI6 headquarters. Just before Zelensky was set to meet with Putin in Normandy format, he went and met with the highest MI6, Secret Service of Great Britain. And Alexander says, can you name any president of any other country or independent country who would go as paid official visit to the Secret Service of another country and talk to their top spies as basically first orders of his business? But Zelensky did it. So his visit before he went to meet with Putin in Normandy format was to British MI6.
Это официальное сообщение об этом.
Alexander said, this is official data. I'm not making this up.
Были. И, ну, о чем, конечно, не говорили, никто об этом не сказал.
Of course, we don't know what they were talking about with Zelensky, the MI6 guys.
Все, после этого Зеленский вышел и сказал, я не буду исполнять Минские соглашения.
But after that visit by Zelensky to the British intelligence services, Zelensky left that meeting and then he came out and said, that's it, I will not be following Minsk agreements, the ceasefire agreements.
Вот мои красные линии. Да, мы зря Украина в 90-х годах отказалась от ядерного оружия. Только...
These are my red lines, Zelensky said. I regret now that Ukraine gave up hosting nuclear weapons, the Soviet at the time nuclear weapons on its territory.
Война только военным путем.
Only war is the answer. Only war is the way that we're going to act, said Zelensky after visiting a British intelligence chief.
Освобождение. И вот он Украину к этому и привел.
So that's where he led Ukraine to. That's what he led Ukraine to. Instead of promising peace, after visiting British MI6 intelligence headquarters, chief of whatever they have there in the British MI6. After that visit, Zelensky came out and said, only war, and I regret that we gave up the hosting of nuclear weapons in Ukraine as well. So basically, Zelensky, according to Alexander from Ukraine, who you see on Ukraine, on your screen, says that Zelensky betrayed everybody, and he totally changed once he became a president. And instead of peace that he was advocating and ran on the platform of peace before he got elected, then he basically started to promote war. Александр, есть ли на Украине демократия? Нам говорят в Америке, что... I'm asking Alexander, who you see on your screen, who is from Ukraine, is there democracy in Ukraine? Наши деньги американских налогов... I'm saying we had been told, American taxpayers, that our taxpayer money of American taxpayers, налогоплательщиков, помогают защитить are helping to protect democracy in Ukraine. Демократию в Украине, и поэтому украинский народ храбро сражается за свою... That's why Ukrainian people are bravely fighting for their democracy and independence. Независимость, и мы должны помогать им нашими деньгами. And we have to help them with our money to do that.
Чтобы они были независимыми и сражались за свое будущее.
For them to keep being independent and fight for their freedom and for their future.
У меня к вам вопрос. Вы
I have a question for you, Alexander.
считаете, что Украина независима или таки зависима и управляема извне Западом?
Do you, Alexander, believe that Ukraine is actually independent, or is it dependent and basically is controlled by the West?
И если на Украине настоящая демократия,
and is a real democracy, as we have been told in America, that Ukraine is this democracy that we need to help save? I'm asking Alexander, who you see on your screen, he's from Ukraine. Is there democracy in Ukraine?
о которой нам здесь говорят в США, которую вы как бы украинские люди защищаете на этой войне?
As if this is a democracy that Ukrainian people are fighting for in this war and fighting to protect.
Нет, никакой демократии
Alexander saying, no, there is no democracy of any
на
kind.
Украине нет. Это реально.
There is no democracy of any kind in Ukraine, says Alexander, who is from Ukraine. You see him on your screen.
Реально тоталитарное государство.
It's a complete totalitarian government and state.
Зеленский это диктатор.
Zelensky is a dictator.
Он своими указами, то есть, ну, просто простой пример, да, Зеленский вводит
With his decrees, he rules.
санкции, США вводит санкции, Европа.
You know how sanctions are invoked by different countries. America invokes sanctions, and Europe invokes
вводит
sanctions.
санкции, Россия вводит санкции.
Russia invokes some sanctions too.
Многие вводят санкции.
Many countries invoke sanctions.
Но есть один момент.
But there is one detail.
Они все вводят санкции в отношении иностранных.
All of those countries are invoking sanctions against the foreign entities and foreign citizens.
Юридических лиц, да, и физических лиц. На Украине тоже есть закон, который позволяет вводить санкции.
Ukraine also has a law that allows Ukraine to invoke sanctions,
Тоже в отношении иностранцев, в отношении
but also against foreign citizens and foreign entities.
граждан Украины. Этот закон на Украине, да, украинскому правительству запрещает вводить санкции.
But in Ukraine, it is prohibited to invoke sanctions against citizens of Ukraine on the territory of Ukraine.
Зеленский своим указом вводит санкции в отношении граждан Украины, нарушая закон, это законом.
Zelensky invokes sanctions against Ukrainian citizens, against Ukrainian constitution and Ukrainian laws, against Ukrainian citizens. Sanctions.
Запрещено, Зеленский вводит. Зеленский
This is prohibited by Ukraine's law, but Zelensky, by his degree, invokes sanctions against the Ukrainian citizens.
закрыл все оппозиционное телевидение.
Zelensky closed all opposition TV channels.
Не судами. Он закрыл, вот знаете, вот как Трамп, да, его бесили те телеканалы, которые он говорил, что они фейки, да, там лгут.
Remember how Trump kept saying that there are all these TV channels that spread fake news when Trump was the president.
Но что было бы в США, если бы Трамп просто своим каким-то решением закрыл бы эти телеканалы?
But what would happen in the United States if Trump decided to make a decree and closed all the TV channels that he considered that are spreading the fake news?
Что было бы? Да, американцы бы так не приняли.
American people would not accept that.
Зеленский закрыл около 10 оппозиционных телеканалов.
Zelensky closed more than 10 opposition channels, the ones that he did not like what they were saying,
Своим указом.
only by his own decree.
Просто своим указом. Где же здесь демократия?
Where's democracy in that?
На сегодня на Украине только один канал, это марафон Зеленского. То есть
The only one channel right now in Ukraine, and that's Zelensky Marathon. The only TV channel is Zelensky Marathon allowed on Ukraine's TV.
там осталось еще штук 5 телеканалов, но они обязаны транслировать только марафон Зеленского.
There are a few other channels, maybe 5 of them that are remaining, but they're only allowed to broadcast the Zelensky Marathon TV channel.
Никакой свободы слова.
There is no freedom of speech in Ukraine.
Вот языки, да, то есть
Let's talk about languages.
США это многонациональное государство, которое уважает
United States is a multi-ethnic state. It has lots of ethnic groups that live in the United States.
права всех, да, вот
But the state respects the rights of all of the different ethnic groups
национальности, которые живут. Там
who live in the United States.
есть, например, анклавы, там, ну, как китайские городки, там, мексиканцы живут, да.
You know how there are different enclaves. There is the little Chinatown here, or maybe there is a Mexican enclave that there is lots of Mexican people live down there in the United States, and the little like places where different people of different ethnic groups tend to like to live together.
Тоже не запрещает им общаться на своих родных языках.
But nobody is prohibiting them from talking in their language amongst themselves.
В США, если я правильно понимаю, там нет даже государственного языка, есть официальный язык английский, да, то есть это язык государства. Так вот,
As far as I understand, in America, there's basically official language, which is English, but it's not like a state language, he says, but it's official language of the state.
на Украине очень много, больше половины людей это люди, для которых родной язык русский.
But in Ukraine, there is many people, even more than half of population are the people in Ukraine for whom the native language is Russian.
Вот этим всем людям запрещено, запрещено обучаться на русском языке.
To all those people, it's now prohibited in Ukraine to study in Russian, to speak in Russian.
Запрещено детей отдавать. Нет ни одного садика, где можно на русском языке.
It's forbidden for them to give their children to any kindergarten which might still be speaking Russian in the kindergarten.
В родной язык вот ребенок знает только русский язык, язык своих родителей. Нет садиков, школы.
He says that if the child only knows the native language of his parents, and let's say it's a Russian language, you cannot find a kindergarten where your child could go to where they would be still speaking Russian. Well, Alexander says more than 50% of the people in Ukraine, for them, native language is Russian, but now it's forbidden to speak Russian in Ukraine.
Это все запрещено, запрещено обслуживание, то есть русский язык, но
You cannot even find services in Russian, so it's forbidden if you're in service industry to speak Russian when you service your clients.
в Украине запрещен во всех сферах общественной жизни. Русский язык, то есть язык миллионов граждан Украины, называет Зеленский языком врага.
Zelensky now calls Russian language the language of millions of people who live in Ukraine. He calls it the language of aggressor.
То есть он воюет с гражданами Украины.
So Zelensky is fighting his own citizens of Ukraine.
Вот война с Россией, это вот знаете, когда-то давно США воевали с Британией. У Британии
You remember how long ago United States were at war with Great Britain?
и у США один язык английский. Но даже
But they share the common language, English.
в те годы, когда США воевали с Британией, когда была гражданская война, в США у руководителей никому в голову не пришло запретить английский язык, да, потому что это язык Британии, их врага.
But even when American revolutionaries were fighting British, nobody in American government would have an idea to disallow the use of English language because it was just because it was the language of Great Britain that they were fighting against.
На тот момент. На Украине запрещают, говорят, что это язык врага и запрещают.
In Ukraine, Russian is forbidden now because they're saying that this is the language of the enemy, so you can't speak it, you can't study it, you can't service people while speaking Russian.
Это тоталитарное государство. Там
Ukraine is totalitarian regime, totalitarian dictatorship state.
человек, который говорит на русском языке и который просто не хочет НАТО, ну, это враг, которого могут даже убить при Зеленском.
The person who simply speaks in Russian language and does not want for Ukraine to join NATO is considered an enemy and can be killed for just these two things, or one of them.
А по поводу денег, американский налогоплательщик.
Let me tell you about American taxpayer money, Alexander adds to his answer.
Вы поймите, Зеленский и коррупция – это слова-синонимы.
Understand that Zelensky and corruption are the words synonyms. They're basically one of the same.
На Украине тотальное воровство.
In Ukraine, there is a totalitarian theft, this totality of theft that's happening in
Те
Ukraine.
деньги, которые выделяют США Украине, они разоровываются. Вот то,
The money that United States is sending to Ukraine, those money is stolen.
что там Зеленский говорит, большое строительство там или еще чего-то, ну это показуху то, что делают.
When Zelensky says that, oh, you're sending us all this great money and we're going to build something with it, Alexander says it's just a show.
На самом деле там завышенные цены.
What they're doing is they're charging exorbitant prices, basically overcharging the government so they could write off some of the juicy differences between what things cost and what is going on paper.
Вот даже гуманитарная помощь, да, первое это был ковид, когда был
Even humanitarian aid, if we take that.
ковид, и вот маски, знаете, эти медицинские,
Remember when we had pandemic,
ну, на лицо маски.
then we had the need for the
В
masks.
Украине тогда их не было. И вот
Ukraine didn't have those masks. So the China sent the plane full of
первое, да,
masks.
пошла гуманитарная помощь, из Китая привезли самолеты с масками, Зеленский со всем своим офисом в аэропорту Борисполь встречает эти маски, да, вот теперь Украина.
So Zelensky met the plane with all the masks sent by China to Ukraine during pandemic and made a big show out of this whole reception that they gave to these humanitarian aid masks coming to Ukraine from China.
Вам будет. А потом через неделю все эти маски видят в больших супермаркетах в продаже, да?
But around the week later, all these masks people started to see on the shelves in the supermarkets, in the grocery stores for sale.
То есть у депутатов, которые близки к Зеленскому.
So those parliament members who own the supermarkets started in those supermarkets, that's where the masks started to show for sale, the masks that China brought as a part of humanitarian aid. The supermarkets that are owned by Zelensky's close officials, those supermarkets starting to feature masks for sale that were brought as part of humanitarian aid from China to Ukraine.
Вот потом, когда началась военная операция, из Европы пошла гуманитарная помощь. И там же на этих всех консервы, да, вот это все. Не для...
From Europe, when the Russian special military operation started in 2022, we started receiving a lot of humanitarian aid, the food and different things, the medical things, the different equipment parts, basically humanitarian aid from Europe.
Продажи. Все это
And all of that ended up on the shelves in the stores for sale.
продается в супермаркетах. Вот Херсон, когда Россия отошла из Херсона, да, вот сейчас много фото, это снимали даже французские журналисты, когда в магазинах на полках хлеб в пакетах, там написано «Организация Объединенных Наций»,
He says even French journalists came to Ukrainian stores and then they were making videos of it where they can find on the store shelves in Ukraine different goods. On the back of the goods, it's written not for sale. This is from UN, but they're all for sale in Ukrainian stores.
Гуманитарная помощь не для продажи, продают даже этот хлеб.
They even sell the bread that came from UN as a part of humanitarian aid in the supermarkets, which are owned by Zelensky's close I don't know, friends, the people from his circle.
То есть Зеленский и воровство это просто синонимы.
So Zelensky and theft are synonyms.
Никакой, вот не надо помогать. Если Америка хочет
So don't do anything, don't help.
спасти украинцев, а не Украину, нужно просто перестать поддерживать вот этот режим.
If America wants to save Ukrainian people and not just Ukrainian regime, then America has to stop fueling the Zelensky regime. If America wants to help Ukrainian people, America needs to stop fueling and help Zelensky's regime.
Нацистский режим, который убивает Украину.
This is a Nazi regime that is killing Ukrainian people.
Спасибо, Александр. Многие у меня спрашивают, почему украинские люди не протестуют эту войну. Я пытаюсь им объяснить, что в Украине сейчас находится военный режим, да, вот у нас называют martial law. Можно ли протестовать? Ну, вы уже ответили, что оппозиционные каналы запрещены. Как я понимаю, Зеленский посадил в тюрьму оппозиционных лидеров. Они все арестованы или они все преследуются. Их имущество отбирается. Сейчас он воюет с церковью, он выгоняет на улицу всех священников, забирают их здания, не разрешают им проводить службу. Я прочла в новостях, что Киево-Могилянская академия сейчас запрещает изучение русского языка. Это так? И то получается, что как бы вы ответили на вопрос, почему украинские люди с этим всем, ну как, я не знаю, соглашаются или...
I'm asking Alexander, who is from Ukraine, who you see on your screen. I'm saying that I hear a lot from people in America who are asking me, how is it people from Ukraine, in Ukraine, are not protesting Zelensky regime? And I'm saying that I know that there is martial law in Ukraine, that people cannot really protest. And of course, the languages are banned. People don't have any rights in Ukraine anymore. People complain about corruption. People complain about theft of humanitarian aid. There is so many problems, but how come people are not protesting? I'm trying to get Alexander's take on why does he think people are not protesting Zelensky regime, to where it sounds like they would have a lot of reasons to do that. And of course, I know that they probably can't at this point, because remember Odessa in 2014, that was even before Zelensky. Some people tried to peacefully protest the coup and they were burned alive in a trade union center in Odessa in Ukraine. But now Zelensky has instituted martial law. But in general, I'm asking Alexander, do Ukrainian people, I mean, do they agree with all that Zelensky is doing? Is that why they're not protesting, or they're just not able to protest because it's forbidden, or it's been basically to become a subject of repression?
Почему они не протестуют, почему они не на улицах? Меня это спрашивают. Я как бы знаю немножко ответ, что, скорее всего, что это просто невозможно, что их просто посадят, убьют или что-то с ними случится. А как бы вы ответили на вопрос, почему украинцы на улицах не протестуют эту войну и режим Зеленского?
Кстати, Киево-Могилянская академия, там же запретили русский язык, не изучать его, да? Это уже запрещено. Обучение на русском языке запрещено.
I've asked Alexander that recently a famous university in Ukraine, Kyivo-Mogilyanska Academy, has forbid the use of Russian language. And Alexander is clarifying, saying, Elena, yes, they forbid the language use, but the problem is it's not only the language that's forbidden, it's also the just speaking amongst yourself on the territory of university in Russian is forbidden. So you cannot even speak Russian language between yourself in the university. If you want to say hello in Russian, you can't do that. Even that is forbidden now. But he says that the studying of Russian language and teaching in Russian was already forbidden before. But they went now further and said that you can't even speak Russian between yourselves in the university.
Запрещено давно. Там запретили на территории академии даже общаться между собой, студентам, преподавателям, чтобы русского языка на территории академии не было.
They don't want any Russian language on the territory of the university, period.
Общаться запретили. Статья, вот просто мы открываем, да, там если американцам говорят, что Украина это правовое демократическое государство, Конституция Украины.
If Americans are saying that Ukraine is, let's say, democratic and lawful state, he said, let's open Ukrainian constitution. If that's what we are told in America, that Ukraine is democratic and lawful state. Alexander says, let's open Ukrainian's constitution.
Статья 10 Конституции.
The Article 10 in Ukraine's constitution,
Часть третья. Черным
Part 3,
по белому написано. В
written in black and white,
Украине гарантируется свободное использование, да,
in Ukraine, it is guaranteed
и развитие и защита русского языка.
the free use, development, and protection of Russian language
На всей территории Украины.
on entire territory of Ukraine.
Вот просто в нарушении Конституции Украины запрещает даже
So now this university or anybody who is prohibiting Russian language on the territory of Ukraine are basically acting against Ukraine's constitution.
общаться между собой на территории.
And they're even prohibiting now in that university, Kievo-Mogilyanska Academy, they now went further and now prohibiting from people speaking Russian even between themselves, basically for social gatherings as well, or interactions in any type of shape or form. And Alexander says this is all unconstitutional because Article 10, Part 3 of Ukrainian Constitution actually ensures the right of people to use, develop, and protects the Russian language on the entire territory of Ukraine.
Академии. И что Зеленский как президент, он гарант Конституции.
And Zelensky, as a president, he guarantees the Constitution.
Он что-то сказал? Нет.
Did he say anything about this university banning Russian language from people even, teaching it, but even speaking amongst themselves? No, Zelensky said nothing.
По поводу протестов.
So as a grantor of Constitution, Zelensky, as a president of Ukraine, said nothing, which basically he should have, because Article 10 in Ukraine's Constitution basically enshrines the rights of the Russian language to be used on the territory of Ukraine. But everybody bans it, and Zelensky says nothing.
2014 года протестовать против режима – это просто табу. Любой человек.
And he says from 2014, after that coup, the Western-backed coup in Ukraine, to protest against the regime is basically death.
Который выйдет, то есть там выходили люди, даже были
He said some people try to come outside and
протесты
protest.
против высокой стоимости на газ.
Some people will protest in the high prices of gas,
Да, на электричество. Вот
electricity.
просто люди выходили, пытались протестовать. Их власть, вот и при Порошенко, и потом уже это было при Зеленском в 2020 году, их просто называли агентами Путина.
The people who went to peacefully protest the high gas prices or the high electricity prices, the people of previous President Poroshenko, as well as people of President now Zelensky, they basically called them Putin's agents.
И полиция могла с ними делать все,
And police could do anything it wants to them.
что угодно. То есть, если любой человек выйдет защитить свои права, неважно какие, его сразу назовут агентом Путина.
So any person who comes out to wants to assert and protect their rights, they immediately called Putin's agent.
Единственных, кого Зеленский боялся, это вот эти нацисты, Азов, правый сектор, потому что они с оружием. Вот когда они шли от него что-то требовать, да, ну там, чтобы еще усилить, что надо того посадить, вот тут, конечно, да, им можно. А людям...
The only people who Zelensky allowed to protest were these Nazi nationalist militants, because when they protest, they're armed. So Zelensky was afraid of them. So they could do whatever they want and protest however they want. If they wanted to scare Zelensky and march and do their protest, Zelensky wouldn't stop them. But any other citizen of Ukraine who wants to peacefully come out and assert their rights and protest something in a peaceful manner, those people are not allowed to do that. They're grabbed by police. But the Nazi type nationalist armed militants, they can protest all day long, because obviously Zelensky allows them to do that, and he would not stop them from doing that.
Свои права защищать, это либо тюрьма, либо смерть.
Я помню, что произошло в Одессе еще до.
And he says that if you just want to come out and protest peacefully to assert your rights, that's either prison or death in Ukraine.
Зеленского в 2014 году, 2 мая, когда люди протестовали против государственного переворота, мирно протестовали, и их завели все эти националисты в здание и подожгли, и сожгли их живьем. И кто пытался выброситься из окна, их били, убивали.
Here I am talking about the people who tried to peacefully protest in 2014, that was even before Zelensky, in Odessa on May 2nd, how they were rounded up by neo-Nazi thugs and burned alive for peacefully protesting way back when they were protesting the coup that took place in Ukraine in 2014.
Об этом.
And I'm saying that I wrote about it and I talked to people about it. And of course, those people who know me personally, they knew that what I'm saying is the truth. But of course, lots of people said, how come we don't see this on TV? Because most people just, unless it's not on TV and unless CNN didn't tell them about it, it must not exist, right? But that was happening in Ukraine back then, even before Zelensky.
Я говорила об этом американским людям здесь. Можно посчитать на пальцах, только те, кто знают меня лично, верили, потому что люди привыкли верить телевизору и телевизионным новостям, а у нас по телевизору об этом ужасе ничего не было не показано, не написано, а это все происходило на Украине. Людей...
And I'm saying that this horrific events of Odessa massacre, when people were burned alive in a trade union building, the peaceful protesters, that all those horrific things that were happening in Ukraine, they never made it to American TV. Our media wouldn't cover that, as if it never happened in Ukraine.
Сжигали живьем за мирный протест.
People were burnt alive for peacefully protesting in Ukraine, for being peaceful protesters.
И сейчас при Зеленском, я так поняла, ничего не улучшилось.
And I'm saying that my understanding is with Zelensky now, it didn't become any better.
А все прийти...
Только хуже стало, да.
Alexander says it only became worse.
И столько стало хуже, запрещение русского языка.
They're banning Russian language.
Я смотрела ваше видео, при Зеленском стали еще больше, еще хуже. Теперь запрещение церкви еще больше, еще хуже.
Now Zelensky is waging even worse war on church, prohibits the priests, prohibits worship, prohibits Russian Orthodox Church, Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which is basically came out of Russian Orthodox Church. So basically everything just became worse, and there is no freedom. There is more harassment by Ukrainian government and Zelensky regime of the language, of the religious freedoms of Ukrainian people. It's just really, like Alexander says, it's a dictatorship. That's what it looks like.
Как вы считаете, украинские солдаты, когда они идут в бой, за что они умирают? Они понимают, что они умирают в моем видении.
I'm asking Alexander, what do you think when Ukrainian soldiers are going on the battlefield and are dying? Do they understand what they're dying for?
Как американского гражданина, за Байдена, и за НАТО, и за Запад, и за их интересы, и за их доноров. А вы как считаете, за что, когда идет в бой?
I'm saying, do the Ukrainian soldiers understand that they are dying for Biden, for NATO, and for Biden and corrupt politicians on both sides, and their interests and the interests of their donors? The Ukrainian soldiers understand what they're dying for.
Украинский солдат против российского, который...
And how could it be possible that Ukrainian soldiers are sent to fight Russians when people have family on both sides? People have lived together for years, they intermarried. There is a grandma who lives in Russia, the grandson who lives in Ukraine. There is a brother-in-law in Ukraine, and the wife is from Russia, and vice versa. And how is it possible that this friendliness that used to always be and exist between Russia and Ukraine, and they used to be part of the same Soviet Union way back when, we had no borders back when Russia and Ukraine were parts and they were republics of Soviet Union, but now they're actually killing each other. That's total impossibility to comprehend, that there is people, these extended families have soldiers, one fighting for Russian army and another fighting in Ukrainian army, and they're all part of one large extended families. It's insane.
Я выросла на Украине, я жила в России.
I'm saying that I grew up in Ukraine, I lived in Russia.
Между нами никогда не было враждебности.
We never had animosity between us.
Мы считали всегда дружественные отношения.
We always had friendly relations between the Russians and Ukrainians.
И как бы братские народы.
And some people would even say brotherly nations. Some people say even one nation. Some say brotherly. No matter how you call it, the people have extended families on both sides of this conflict that are fighting each other.
Я не знаю, кто-то считает братские, кто-то считает близкие, кто-то один народ, кто как считает, но факт остается фактом, что нам нечего было делить, у нас
We had nothing to fight over.
Никогда не было враждебности.
We never had animosity towards each other.
И вдруг украинские ребята идут воевать против тех, у кого семьи на обеих сторонах этой.
And all of a sudden, Ukrainian guys are going fighting basically the same people who extended family they are part of.
Войны, потому что люди женились, у людей дети, внуки, бабушка на Украине, мама в России, папа в России, внук на Украине, там.
People have mother in Russia, father from Ukraine, mother from Russia, and then they just intermarried, and they have all these huge families that comprise from both Russians and Ukrainians.
Брат или сестра, а сейчас эти люди идут друг друга убивать. В моем понимании, за Байдена и за
In my understanding, that they are going to kill each other for Biden.
Коррупционных политиков
and for corrupt politicians on both sides.
Запада и Украины.
The West and Ukraine.
А в вашем понимании, за что, как вы думаете, умирают украинские солдаты, когда они идут в бой? Как вы
What do you, Alexander, think? For what Ukrainian soldiers are dying when they go into battle?
думаете?
Они заложники, то есть,
Alexander says they're hostages.
Им либо тюрьма, либо мобилизация, то есть.
They either have to be drafted and mobilized to go fight, or they have to go to prison in Ukraine.
Там, когда они идут в атаку, есть заградотряды, так называется, заградительные отряды. Это...
And when they're going into fight in a battle, they have what they call guarding troops behind them.
Те, кто они сзади, да, эти нацисты.
These are Nazi battalions that are basically sent behind the guys who are mobilized, and they're making sure that mobilized guys do not turn back from the battle and don't run backwards. So the mobilized guys, the guys who are drafted, are put forward. Behind them, there is a line of what they call Nazi battalions, and they make sure that they shoot the guys if they were dreaming to escape and go backwards and not forwards in the battle.
Это Азов, то есть вот дают приказ, да, иди наступай. Кто не наступает, стреляют в спину и убивают.
And for example, Azov battalion, they give them the order, say, we're going forward, but if those who do not want to go forward, you just go ahead and kill those guys.
Это практика с 2014 года, да, то есть.
He says they practiced it since 2014 in Ukraine.
Гонят на убой.
They're sending those Ukrainian mobilized guys basically to slaughter, like cannon fodder.
Просто гонят на убой. Люди могут и не хотеть воевать. Их забрали вот сейчас, сколько видео, просто в дом врываются, забирают там у семьи, дети, жены плачут. И просто...
Those Ukrainian guys, for most part, maybe they don't even want to go fight, but they're being called to draft, and they've been grabbed from their homes. There are lots of videos on the internet you can find where the armed man basically storms somebody's house. The wife is crying, the children are crying, but they're grabbing the guy and sending him into the army forcibly, because that's what they do. It's mobilization in Ukraine, so they're drafting everybody and grabbing everyone to send them to the front lines.
Забирают и отправляют на фронт без обучения, без ничего.
Without even any adequate training or anything.
Никакой подготовки. До них не доходит ни еда. Сколько эти солдаты
They don't even have any adequate training, or they don't even have food over there while they're at the front lines.
Записывают видео, что есть нечего, одна буханка хлеба.
A lot of guys who are Ukrainian soldiers on the front lines are making videos saying that, look, we don't have any food here. We just have one bread loaf for all of us.
Там им на отделение, говорит, где это гуманитарное, где эти деньги? Вот
Then the guys at the front lines, Ukrainians, are saying, where all this money that Ukraine's getting? Where is all the humanitarian aid that Ukraine's getting? We don't see any of it on the front line here, the Ukrainian soldiers saying in their videos.
США дают миллиарды, где они, куда они?
United States gives billions. Where all these billions? The guys at the front line are asking.
Ходят, им есть нечего.
These guys at the front line, they have no food at the front line.
Солдаты там записывают видео, там же тоже православные, да, служат. Они записывают видео, что вы там в тылу творите.
The Ukrainian soldiers are even making videos and saying, what are you doing there back home?
Нашу церковь вы запрещаете. То есть
You're forbidding our own church.
за что мы воюем? За то,
What are we fighting for?
чтобы потом некуда было вернуться.
Are we fighting, say, Ukrainian soldiers, that when we go back home, there is nowhere to go to? And the Ukrainian soldiers are basically appalled and disgusted of the closures of churches back home while they're on the front line fighting for Ukraine. Ukraine is closing the churches and their wives and grandmothers cannot go to church and worship. So Ukrainian guys are saying, what are you doing? What are we fighting here for on the front line?
То есть там много русскоязычных, да.
There are many Russian speakers on the front lines and in Ukraine.
Действительно, в 2012 году, если бы кто-то сказал, что вот украинцы будут убивать русских, то все просмеялись.
And if anybody would tell me in 2012 that Russians will fight Ukrainians, nobody would believe it. It would be taken as some type of a bad joke.
И тем более с 2014 года, то не с Россией они воевали. Они же убивали своих сограждан.
And from the 2014, those guys on the front lines, Ukrainian soldiers, they were not fighting with Russia. They were killing their own citizens since 2014. Remember Eastern Ukraine, bombings and attacks by Ukrainian military on the Eastern Ukrainian region. So Alexander says from 2014, they were killing their own people of Ukraine, not Russian army.
На Донбассе, в Донецкой,
in Donbass,
Луганской области. Вот
in Donetsk and Lugansk provinces.
это ненависть. Джордж Сорос, он же честно признался, что...
And this hatred basically has spread, and Soros admitted himself, George Soros,
Ему удалось это сделать.
that he succeeded in bringing this animosity between Russians and Ukrainians.
Что он тогда еще, в 90-х годах, да, они обсуждали, что если с Россией воевать, им нужна будет вот страна-наемник, такая как Украина, чтобы воевать чужими жизнями с Россией.
So Soros admitted in one of his interviews that in order to fight Russia, they would have to find a mercenary country by hand of whose people that would actually, they will be able to fight Russia. So in such country, the country by whose hands now the West is able to fight Russia was found, that became Ukraine. And Soros bragged about being successful in finding that country that they could use against Russia.
Они своими, да, не...
So they don't have to fight with their own hands. So now they're fighting by Ukrainian hands. The proxy country, the proxy war.
Жизнями своих стран, потому что, например, в США вот после Вьетнамской войны, да, то есть, плохо, я так понимаю, американцы отнеслись бы, чтобы если бы отправили граждан Америки сейчас воевать с Россией где-то, да?
He says, I know that citizens of America, especially after Vietnam War, would not look favorably if America would want to send American citizens and American troops on the ground into Ukraine to fight Russia.
Поэтому вот страна-наемник.
So here we have a country, the proxy, Ukraine.
И Сорос, он честно сказал, что он вложил несколько миллиардов для того, чтобы вот страну эту захлестнула ненависть к русским.
And Soros admitted that he spent several $billion in order to make this country, Ukraine, basically get drowned in these feelings of animosity towards each other.
И у них получилось. Многих
And he succeeded, and he brags about it.
они вот сделали людьми, которые ненавидят просто русских.
So they made Ukrainians basically into these people who basically hate Russians and everything that has to do with Russia.
Александр, какое будущее у Зеленского, как вы думаете?
I'm asking Alexander what future Zelensky might have. What does he think Zelensky's future looks like?
Сколько еще ему осталось руководить Украиной? У него, кажется, выборы в 2024 году.
I'm saying it looks like Zelensky may be up for re-election in the year 2024. And of course, when Zelensky ran, he promised that he only is going to be one-term president. He said, I just want to be one-term president. I'm asking Alexander, who is from Ukraine, who you see on your screen, what he thinks Zelensky's future looks like.
Да, и он, по-моему, говорил, что он только на один срок баллотироваться будет. Есть ли там у него теперь желание, теперь какой он популярный? Что вы думаете, какое у него будущее?
Ну, он много чего говорил на один срок, он врал очень много, лишь бы прийти к власти. Но у него не будет второго срока, ему насколько...
Alexander says, yeah, the fact that he said he's going to be one-term president, he said too many other things as well. So Alexander doesn't think that Zelensky is going to have a second term.
Я понимаю, даже посол США на Украине, она ему об этом уже сказала, что у США, насколько я понимаю, ну, у Байдена, да, у администрации, есть уже другие фавориты, ну, на эту должность, если Украина, конечно же, останется к тому времени. То есть Зеленский, насколько я понимаю, он уже не интересен, то есть он много знает, воровство, то есть сейчас США аудиторы, ну, на Украине занимаются, я там видел объявления, даже на Украине печатают, когда там, ну, американские спецслужбы, да, они уже даже не доверяют вот тем антикоррупционным органам, которые они же за свои деньги на Украине посоздавали, они не доверяют и пишут телефоны вот там, в США, то есть...
Alexander says that Zelensky's name equals corruption, and American auditors now who are in Ukraine, who are trying to find how does corruption work in Ukraine in those agencies that American anti-corruption agencies themselves created. They don't even trust those anti-corruption and agency officials themselves. So now American auditors are posting the little announcements on the lampposts in Ukraine saying, give us a call if you know anything about corruption, because Alexander says Zelensky regime equals corruption, and even American auditors who created Ukrainian anti-corruption agencies cannot trust Ukrainian anti-corruption officials. So they solicit in public to basically call them in secret or however and report on the corruption instances because they can't even trust anti-corruption officials in Ukraine that American themselves helped to create those agencies in Ukraine.
У кого есть информация, говорите о коррупции, вот о разворовывании вот этой военной помощи Украине.
So basically, American auditors are soliciting public to call on hotlines and report if they know anything about corruption or humanitarian aid theft in Ukraine.
То есть Зеленский, ну, я бы не сказал, что он на Украине сейчас популярен. Это, ну, вот так.
He says, I wouldn't say that Zelensky is really popular in Ukraine right now.
Слава, которую там ему создали, это, да, там, на обложке журнала и все остальное. Но я хочу напомнить, что Гитлер тоже был, да, лицом. Вот,
yeah. He says that popularity that was created for him artificially by placing him on magazine covers and doing all these photo shoots and giving him all this publicity. But he says, let me remind you that Hitler also was on the magazine covers in his day.
На обложках в свое время. А сейчас, ну, я очень надеюсь, что и в США изменится политика, придут.
Alexander says, I really very much so hope that the policies of United States will change.
К власти нормальные
And I hope that to power will come normal people.
люди, которые, вот как Трамп говорил, да, сделаем Америку великой.
Just as Trump said, let's make America great. Those type of people.
Америка великая независимо от
The America is a grand independent country.
того, какая Украина. То есть Америка
And its grandeur and its glory of America does not depend on what kind of Ukraine is out there.
должна заниматься своими делами, а Украина, ну, то есть украинцы должны решить, что будет. А Зеленский
And America has to mind its own business and take care of its own country. And Ukraine has to be taken care of by Ukrainians. And Ukrainian people have to decide how to govern Ukraine.
будущего, я не верю, что он пойдет на второй срок.
As far as Zelensky's future, I don't believe that he will be going on a second term, Alexander says.
И я уверен, что он не нужен ни американцам, ни британцам, никому. Это Зеленский думает, что он миллиарды наворовал, и потом он будет где-то красиво жить. Но вот история, да,
Alexander says, I don't believe that Zelensky is needed by either Great Britain or United States or Europe or anybody. In his own mind, he thinks that he stole billions of dollars and then he's going to have a happy life afterwards someplace in his mansion somewhere around the world.
конфликтов этих показывают, вот особенно как из Афганистана США выходили, да, когда
But he says, I think it's going to be more along the lines like American exit out of Afghanistan.
вот там те, которые служили против Афганистана местно на администрацию США, когда они там на шасси самолетов, да, пытались залезть.
And those people who are working with Americans while American troops and America was in Afghanistan, when America was pulling out, they were trying to hang on the plane chassis because they were afraid to be remaining in Afghanistan and were afraid of retaliation for cooperating with Americans.
И улететь, ну, потому что они боялись остаться. Точно так же, как только Зеленский перестанет быть нужным администрации Байдена.
The same way, as soon as Zelensky will not be needed by Biden administration anymore,
Кто там на тот момент будет,
or whoever will be in charge of America at that moment,
он точно так же уйдет куда-то в не столь
at the same way, Zelensky will disappear somewhere.
отдаленные места, скорее всего.
Александр, быстренько последний вопрос нашего интервью. Что вы думаете нужно для мира? Для того,
Alexander, last question of our interview. What do you think we need for peace?
чтобы на Украину пришел мир?
In order to have peace come to Ukraine.
Чтобы на Украину пришел мир, американцы должны договориться с Россией.
In order for peace to come to Ukraine, Americans have to negotiate with Russia. And they have to work out agreement with Russia.
Эта война идет не, она идет просто на Украине, да, вот НАТО воюет с Россией на Украине.
This war, it's happening just in Ukraine, but NATO is fighting Russia just only on the territory of Ukraine.
И Украиной, украинцами.
And by the hands of Ukrainians.
Вот противоречия они гораздо больше.
So the differences between NATO and Russia or United States and other countries who are fueling this conflict and Russia, they're bigger than this conflict.
Да, вот, ну, это просто одна из точек, где
Ukraine is just one of the points where
НАТО воюет с Россией.
where NATO is fighting Russia. It's just one of the places where NATO is fighting Russia, Ukraine is.
Поэтому США должны признать интересы России. Украина, по сути, да, то есть.
So United States have to recognize Russia's interests.
Вот если мы посмотрим на Украину, посмотрим на историю. История ж не 30 лет, Украине 30.
If we look at the history, Ukraine is only 30 years old as a country. But the history is not 30 years old. The history is thousands of years old.
30 лет. А городам, которые на территории Украины расположены, им 100, 200 лет, 300 лет.
The towns that are situated on the territory of Ukraine, they're 200, 300, several hundred years old.
И все эти города основывала Российская
So all these towns were founded by Russian Empire.
империя. Если все эти города основывали русские, если на Украине живут русские, если эта земля тысячи лет называлась, да,
If this land was a part of Russian land, if the Russian people who live on that land, they speak Russian language on that
Людей,
land,
которые там жили, называлось русской землей.
and it was called Russian land for generations and thousands and hundreds of
Но
years.
какая Украина? Украине всего
So what Ukraine we're talking
лишь
about?
30 лет.
Ukraine is only 30 years old on that land.
А Россия там была сотни лет. Русские
And Russia was there for hundreds of years on that land.
проливали кровь за эту землю. И
Russian people fought and bled and lost their lives for this land over the centuries.
во времена Второй мировой войны, и во
And during the World War II,
времена предыдущих войн, даже когда еще
and during the previous wars,
Наполеон приходил, да, и шведы, когда приходили, они тоже на территории Украины бились. Из Польши
and there were wars between Napoleon and Russia and Swedes and Russia
бились. То есть это земля
on that very territory.
русская, поэтому США
So this is Russian land.
должны это признать, что
So American United States, they have to recognize that fact,
ну, они перешли красные линии, то есть они
that they have stepped over the red lines. United States have to understand that they crossed over red lines.
должны выйти. У России это мощное государство, у которого есть свои интересы, которые
And they have to recognize that Russia is a powerful state that has its own interests.
ну, имеет право, да, вот как США говорят, они
And it has a right
там безопасность для США.
to have its security, just like United States says it has security interests and wants to make sure it provides itself a security.
Превыше всего, да.
And United States considers its security above all.
Но не российские ракеты стоят, да, там
But these are not Russian rockets
где-то у границ США. Это
that stand someplace nearby the borders of United States.
США подошло к границам России.
It's United States that came with their military complex next to the borders of Russia.
Просто напомню Карибский кризис американцев,
I will only remind you the Caribbean crisis with
когда Советский Союз установил ракеты
when the Soviet Union was placing the rockets in Cuba.
на острове Куба, весь мир стоял на грани ядерной войны.
The entire world was on the brink of nuclear war back then.
И сейчас США вот противоположно, зеркально вот так же действует.
And now there is a mirror image. Now United States is acting in mirror image to that crisis.
Вот они пытаются установить свои ракеты и свои базы на Украине.
Now United States and NATO trying to position their rockets and their military bases in Ukraine.
Вот, ну, на подлетное время, как Путин говорил, 5 минут до Москвы.
And Putin, president of Russia, was saying with those rockets flying time about 5 minutes to Moscow.
Да, то кто в данном случае не прав?
So who is not right in this situation? Who is the neuron in this situation, says Alexander from Ukraine, who you see on your screen.
Россия не может это оставить без ответа. США
Russia cannot leave this without an answer that United States is trying to place their rockets on Ukraine up to Russia's border.
просто должны уйти. Это Евразия.
United States simply have to leave, and this is Eurasia.
Здесь безопасностью должны заниматься только те государства, которые расположены в Евразии, да.
The security guarantees should be provided by those states who are part of Eurasia.
Европа после времен Второй мировой войны до сих пор оккупирована США.
Europe is still occupied by United States since the World War II.
Потому что Советский Союз в 90-м году вывел все свои военные базы с территории Европы.
Because Soviet Union removed all its military bases from Europe's territory.
А Соединенные Штаты в
In the 90s.
1945 году как построили свои военные базы, ну, прошлого века, да, в 1945-м, так они там и остались. США
And United States, as soon as they built their military bases in Europe in 1945 or 1940s, they're still there, those military bases. And Russia withdrew its troops and removed its bases from Europe, but United States didn't.
до сих пор оккупируют Европу.
So United States are still occupying Europe.
На североамериканском континенте там нет российских баз.
On the Northern American continent, there are no Russian military bases.
Вот и американских баз не должно быть на Евразии. Вот тогда
So there shouldn't be any American bases in Eurasia.
будет мир на всей планете.
Then there will be a peace on the entire planet. Says Alexander. Oh, guys, it was a long interview, but I promised you this interview, promised you to do this live, and I finally was able to connect with Alexander. His name is Alexander Skubchenko. He's on your screen. He's from Ukraine, and he gave me this interview today earlier. We did it on Skype, so I was able to record it and bring you on this live, because of course Skype doesn't allow to do lives. The technology is not there, so I'm doing it this way. Hope you enjoyed the interview. Everybody who was watching, Mohammed says Zelensky will become like bin Laden when he will not be needed anymore. Yeah, kind of sounds like Zelensky maybe soon will be phased out and his brand will be discontinued by the West. Okay, guys, this is a great interview. You can rewatch it, go back, rewind it, go front. In this interview, I'm interviewing Ukrainian man, Alexander Skubchenko, who lived in Ukraine all these years. And I've wanted to ask him a few questions about what really is happening in Ukraine. Is Ukraine democracy, as we've been told by Biden? What does he think will take to bring peace to Ukraine? What are Ukrainian soldiers fighting for? What about Zelensky? How come his policies are turning to be banning all Russian language, banning opposition parties? Did he turn into some type of a dictator? So all these different questions I asked Alexander. Make sure that you guys subscribe to my YouTube channel. If you're watching on YouTube, hello. If you're watching on Facebook, hello. Since I had to change the time of this live, it really helps, guys, when you subscribe to my YouTube channel, so you will be notified if you click the bell when I go live, so you don't miss all of my new shows and my new interviews. I have another interview I will be uploading to YouTube shortly here with another wonderful guest. So you want to subscribe to my YouTube channel, Elena USA Live. You see the QR code on your screen. Point your phone camera to that QR code and click on it, and you will be taken to my YouTube channel, because I will be posting another interview with another exciting guest later today. And everybody who was on the live today, I thank you for your patience. I was trying to translate it as we went. I didn't even have a chance to watch this interview myself because I wanted to make sure you guys see it as promised today. So thank you very much, DKCB. Thank you very much, Jean. And thank you, everyone watching from across the globe. Again, this interview was with Alexander Skubchenko. He's from Ukraine. Make sure you guys watch this interview if you missed the beginning. And he had some very interesting insight to tell us about the Ukraine, about Zelensky, about the war in Ukraine. So we can learn what the person who actually lived in Ukraine through all these years up until a few months ago. So he has a firsthand knowledge of what Zelensky policies are, what Ukraine is going through. I think it was a great, valuable interview. So I hope for you guys to see you on my next lives. And see if we have any more comments here. We have Carolyn Logan saying thank you. And thank you very much. Again, everybody who typed thank you for your time, thank you for your patience, thank you for watching. And subscribe to my YouTube channels, guys. Elena USA Live on YouTube. I will be posting another interview with another guest over there shortly, and we will be speaking English in that interview. So I have also another comment really quick before I go. I think Molly says thank you. Thank you, Molly. Thank you, everybody who is watching and who watched and spent this time with us on live. Anybody who came late, make sure to watch this interview from the beginning. Talk to you soon, guys, and thank you very much. Have a great the rest of your Sunday. Have a great evening. Love you.